Welcome to the Artfully Learning audio series. I'm your host, Adam Zucker. There are many examples of modern and contemporary artists attempting to channel childlike qualities in their art. Renowned 20th century avant-garde artists like Jean Dubuffet and Joan Miro are well known for their mature paintings that appear to incorporate imagery reflecting various phases of early childhood artistic development. Pablo Picasso is attributed to having said, "When I was a child, I could draw like Raphael, but it took me a lifetime to learn to draw like a child." Although society typically assigns generational demarcations to certain visual and literary content, visual art has a potential to be accessible to both younger and older demographics at once, without diluting its aesthetic and contextual importance. This is in part due to the diligence and ingenuity of museum educators, who are working artists that are trained in supporting early childhood and adolescent learners. Museums, like the Children's Museum of the Arts in New York City, are examples of how institutions provide an ample space for work by established professional artists to coexist in an environment that is intended for kids. The intergenerational cohabitation of art made by adults and children have benefits that transcend and eschew age limits. Joining me now in conversation is Seth Cameron. Seth is an artist and educator. He co-founded the artist collective Bruce High Quality Foundation and established the Bruce High Quality Foundation University, an unaccredited free collaborative school that offered a cross-disciplinary approach to art-centered learning. In 2020, Seth became the executive director of the Children's Museum of the Arts. Hey Seth, I'd like to start out by asking you about your earliest memory of an art experience or art educational experience.
I love this question. I actually recently gave a lecture at Micah kind of entirely about this question, but that was about an hour long, so I'll abbreviate. I have two earliest experiences that I think are important, and one was I have a memory of making a drawing that my mother ended up saving, and as far as I know, it's one of the only things that got saved from when I was maybe around 4 years old. And it was a drawing of ostensibly a self-portrait of me looking between my own legs. So you see the back of the legs and then the head upside down between the legs, some the grass along the bottom. And according to my mother, the reason she saved it is because she saw that I didn't rotate the paper to draw the face. So at that point I'm 4 and I'm doing a kind of ideographic drawing, pretty common, where faces are represented somewhat symbolically. And she saw me hesitate and decided not to rotate the paper and thought that was important. And so I think it's important too, that there was some kind of decision making and a sort of personal challenge I was setting up for myself, like, can I draw this face upside down? And so that's one. And the other one, kind of coming from the other direction, was an experience of seeing a work of art that was a batik, an abstract batik work that my stepfather had brought home from Korea that hung over our kitchen table. And it was one of the only pieces of art we had in the house, and I grew up looking at it, and it's the first artwork I remember having questions about. Like, I didn't understand why it was art. And because it was there all the time, that question of why is this art just became a theme.
So through creating, viewing, and analyzing works of art, you really got the full artistic experience early on. Did you grow up in an artistic household?
Not really. Like, my mother was a kindergarten teacher, so I would say there was a creative household, and one where she was very conscious to give me space to be creative, but not particularly artistic, and there were no artists in the family. My stepfather had just curiously good taste, but we probably had maybe these 2 or 3 pieces from Korea. They're the only things that ever hung up in our house, along with more as like family photographs.
When you were mentioning the drawing that you made and your mother's reaction, I actually thought in my mind to ask you if she was an educator. And sure enough, her background as a kindergarten teacher makes a lot of sense in that context.
Yeah, like my sort of joke is that I went to kindergarten for like 18 years because I would go to kindergarten after school every day, and I would have the kind of run of the classroom. So this was a public school kindergarten room with the centers, and I was very conscious of the way that she would redesign the room and set things out in a certain way. But that was like my free time before we would go home. Like while she was working on her lesson plans, I would, even as I grew older up into like high school, I would spend a lot of time in a kindergarten classroom. Which is, it's like, it's a certain it's related to art, but it's adjacent.
So you really had the lifelong kindergarten experience, so to speak. There's definitely something to be said of that early childhood model continuing to shape our minds as we get older. And of course, one challenge is being able to get back to that childlike mindset and to retain it as adults. What about museums? Were they an integral part of your childhood?
Not childhood. I think formative experiences with museums for me probably didn't happen until like high school. I was on my first really important museum experience was one that I had alone. I was 16 and I'd been touring the country as part of a drum and bugle corps, and we had a day off in Washington D.C. And so I went to the National Gallery and saw there was a Rothko retrospective at the time. So this must have been 1996, 7, something like that. And that was like an early experience of being in a museum and of having a sense of what a museum experience could be that would be like meaningful. But I was also kind of just coming into a sort of consciousness of art history and the art world like around that time. So I was also starting to read a lot more. But childhood, I grew up in the rural South, so there weren't a lot of museums around.
When did you first know you were going down this path to become an artist, and what kind of support did you get? You mentioned that you were given space to explore artistically at home. What about your formative K-12 educational experience?
Yeah. I mean, I think that early support from my parents was really important, and then other like kids and teachers, would tell me I could draw, and it was something I liked doing. I spent a lot of time just drawing and making things. I think it's probably later, like in high school, when I started to make things that might not have looked like art to other people, to like sort of immediate context, that there was a little pushback, but by then I started to make other communities, like make friends from like specialized schools and things like that. So I mean, I always had some support, and we didn't really talk about it as a professional path of any kind. No one really knew what that even meant. Like the idea of a professional artist wasn't a thing that we really knew anything about. And then like college was the real like opportunity for me. I went to Cooper Union, and I was lucky enough to have a scholarship, and I think that made the real difference, being able to move to New York and have that financial question at least mitigated with a scholarship.
And that experience of moving to New York and studying at an institution that's renowned for its art department, like the Cooper Union, that must have had a formative impact on your development as an artist.
Yeah, it was a really special moment of where I think there's a kind of like leveling in a way, like you're no longer like the star of your like local community, and you have to embrace like how different kinds of talent and different kinds of creativity emerge in people from different walks of life. And so that's really the thing that happens at Cooper. When it happens, it can be really amazing. It's such a small school in such a large context, so you get you kind of get both sides of having a very close-knit community that's very diverse, but there's a kind of safety in its size and then you're in the context of the big city where you can obviously like touch into all kinds of other communities at the same time.
And during your time at Cooper Union, speaking of community, you were one of the co-founders of the art collective Bruce High Quality Foundation, which in and of itself combined elements of art, pedagogy, and social activism. And actually, one of my formative educational experiences came through the Bruce High Quality Foundation University. While I was in actual grad school at the City College of New York, I took a philosophy of film class at the Bruce High Quality Foundation University.
With Michael Brent?
Yeah, and Peter Duhan.
Yes.
And
amazing.
yeah, it was an amazing experience. And, while I was going to grad school, I didn't really have the academic background that a lot of my peers had. So being at the Bruce High Quality Foundation University, in conjunction with what I was learning in grad school, really put things into perspective because it was more of a social environment. And through art-centered learning, watching these films, I really got, I would say, a hands-on or an experiential idea of what philosophy was and how to put it in context. For me, watching a film and then discussing it in this informal social setting was a lot more accessible and apt to the way I learned than to read an academic or scholarly paper that was assigned to me.
Yeah, it was sort of like halfway between a seminar, like postgraduate program, and then just like a clubhouse, and it could kind of shift between those even within the same sort of class. I mean, part of it was just setting up a situation where like people were only there if they wanted to be. There was sort of no, I think that was the biggest difference between the sort of social community that happened at BHQFU and other kinds of school experiences. That like, well, people didn't want to come. Like everyone who was there actually like chose to be there and wanted the experience, and so I think that immediately makes for a more pleasant dynamic.
Can you describe the impetus behind the Bruce High Quality Foundation University and what takeaways or assessments you have from it?
Sure. And I think when it started, we've been working as a collective for a few years already, and I mean, I can actually remember when the idea kind of started to become clear. It was a friend of ours had stopped by the studio. We had a studio in Brooklyn, and people would come by all the time because we were always there making things, and we would have barbecues, and people would come hang out. And I can remember this friend of ours from school had come by, and he was complaining about like graduate school applications. How he felt really compelled, like he had to go to graduate school, but he didn't want to. And we were just asking the questions, like, what do you hope to get out of the experience and so forth, like trying to help him think through it. And realizing, like, well, isn't that kind of what we're doing now? Like, you're coming here, we're talking about your work, spend time with it. Like, what's the real difference between the piece of paper and the version that's done through a more formal institution and doing it through a kind of social network of people? And that was kind of that was the kernel of the idea. Is like, let's just build our own school and to build it out of that kind of kitchen table mentality. I learned a lot from the experience. We tried out a lot of different things, different formats for classes. I think in the last couple of years, so it ran for 8 years. The last couple of years, we were really trying to build it into a program that incorporated a residency element and in a kind of longer life cycle, so that people that would come through and be residents would design a class over a period of time and then implement that class. And so I was becoming really interested in this idea of a kind of progressive model of education where teachers or students are kind of, there's a Colearning is really built in, that like building the curriculum is part of what we're studying, like how to build the curriculum becomes part of that puzzle. So very much like looking at it as a kind of bootstrapped version of like John Dewey's lab school in Chicago. The idea that if you want, so thinking about early childhood education is actually really important because the lab school, the idea was we'll build a K through 12 program, but we'll also have the faculty who are leading that will be studying early childhood education. So everyone has skin in the game. Everyone is studying something. So we were trying to take that and translate it into a model of postgraduate education.
And what about any enduring lessons that came out of operating this educational environment? Were there any particular challenges?
I think the thing that always stayed with me that really, in some ways, compelled shifting, feeling like it was time to close it down and think about other opportunities was always having the sense that we were getting to a problem too late, that most of the people who came through the Bruce School already had undergraduate and graduate degrees. So while there's lots that was great about that, we weren't actually speaking to people who might be coming out of high school, might be thinking about how to become part of an artistic community. We weren't really giving them that opportunity, because you wouldn't really go to the Bruce School instead of going to a regular BFA program or something. And we had never really figured out a way to shift that focus. And when I had kids, I really became more conscious of thinking about it. Rather than aging down slowly into high school and beyond, I really started going back to my history and thinking about arts education from the very beginning. How does this actually function? I thought your question was spot on. Thinking about what were those early moments for me that got me thinking about what it means to be an artist and how to think like an artist, and can I have some influence in that space? And then that's when the opportunity to work for the Children's Museum of the Arts came up. It felt like kismet.
Well, yeah, that's a great segue into your role at the Children's Museum of the Arts. Can you talk a little about what inspired you to transition into early childhood and adolescent art education?
A whole bunch of stuff happened. I definitely think the Bruce studio practice was always we were always a bit uneasy about our relationship to the moneyed art world. And that was always there as an issue. I always felt like I would rather find some other way of participating. And I'd had this kind of other experience the whole time of I'd been teaching, the whole since I graduated. I taught various classes at the undergraduate and graduate level, and then didn't really feel like I wanted to be a full-time teacher in that way, full-time studio instructor. But I'd also had an experience working in nonprofits, both founding a school I founded as a nonprofit organization. So I learned that sort of from doing it, the ins and outs of nonprofit administration, and got to know at least some of the mechanics of how that works. So I think those things kind of all felt like they made sense, that I like the nonprofit space, at least as an opportunity to be able to try things out. That's kind of how I think of it, is that small nonprofits are kind of like the startups of what should eventually become social services that our taxes pay for. Might be a bit of a fantasy, but I like to think that it's if we make this work really, really well, and eventually this is something that should just become part of the social safety net.
In a perfect world, yeah, for sure.
In a totally perfect world, we wouldn't need to have all of these nonprofits trying to solve problems.
Right.
Just support it. But in the meantime, I think small nonprofits are a great place to really be able to experiment and try things out. And yeah, it's slower than what you can do sometimes in a completely for-profit universe, but I think it at least keeps you motivated in the right direction.
Now, what are some of the takeaways from developing a program for higher education that you bring into your role at the museum?
Well, I definitely think that idea of co-learning is a really important one. And I actually try to think of it so much that we're not actually, even though we're the Children's Museum of the Arts, it's less that we're trying to transmit knowledge to children, and more that we're trying to include children in the world of arts learning. So it should be about sharing those experiences. between adults and children, and not so much trying to say that we have some specialized knowledge. We might have all kinds of interesting ways of delivering interesting lessons that expose them to sort of fundamentals of shape, line, color, texture, value, space, form, etc. But ultimately, I think we want to create an environment where adult artists feel like they're learning as much from the children are as well. So I think that idea of co-learning is really essential, and is a kind of what I hope becomes a real difference about how the Children's Museum of the Arts works in relationship to maybe the way that some other arts programs out there exist for kids. It's really about putting kids into saying you're already an artist. You have things to learn and you have things to teach.
You said that kids are already artists. So what does it mean to be an artist, and how does one live artfully?
That's a really simple question. I'm kidding. I do think all children are artists in a kind of fundamental way. That the way that we come to know the world is through making things. And that can be making things in a directed or undirected way. It can be a combination of those things. I think we can think aesthetically from the day we're born. And I think it's a fundamental part of how children think. So I think children start with this capacity and interest to learn through their eyes and their senses, and being able to decide how much they want to control what they're seeing and what others see and experience. And our job as educators is to try to prolong that sort of autodidactic investment in learning through the phenomenological experience.
Right. And that's why intergenerational dialogue and collaboration between adult artists and children can be such a profound experience for the overall development of both demographic groups. Of course, throughout modernism, it's well documented that artists looked to children's artwork for inspiration and ideas. But one notable exception was an exhibition of Joseph Cornell's sculptures at the Cooper Union, which was specifically designed for the youth. Instead of making his work look childlike, he made his avant-garde concepts accessible to children by altering the height of the work so that it was right at their eye level. He was also extremely attentive to their interpretations and questions. Cornell's understanding of childhood and the importance of incorporating children's participation within the cultural discourse is a model that is carried on today through art museums designed specifically for children. Do you find this intergenerational relationship to be the general atmosphere at the Children's Museum of the Arts?
Absolutely. I think even especially for practicing and grown-up, so to speak, artists, it's really easy for us to get in our own way, and kind of we build up all of this language, whether that's art speak or anything else, that helps us actually mask a lot of what we're doing and what we might experience from a work of art. And actually just having to talk, describe your work to a child, and try to do that in a way that's honest, and it actually changes how you think about your own work. So it actually allows you to think differently about what you're doing, and that interaction is immensely valuable. I have to explain to my kids my art all the time, and I can't give them a lecture on the sublime. If I do, I'm going to have to figure out another way to get there. It's not about dumbing it down. It can actually be about trying to clarify it and say it without presuming that they've read 3,000 books, but trying to get to the core of the idea some other way.
And they might even come up with that on their own terms if they are just given permission to look and ask questions, or just as importantly, asked how they feel and what they think about the work they're viewing. And that's what you've done so well at the Children's Museum of the Arts. Your museum is notable for its integration of sophisticated exhibitions by contemporary artists and its Artist in Residence program, both of which take a child-centered approach, but are also generationally seamless in that they can be profound for visitors of all ages. What do you find to be some of the greatest benefits of having these types of programs and experiences within a child-centered environment?
Well, I think what I've seen is that it's a lot of work, and it hasn't been an easy. We're in our first year of the residency, and one of the big challenges has been the pandemic. Continues to be a real burden. We haven't been able to have as much in-person experience, being able to actually place our teaching artists in context of like working directly with kids. We're trying to do more of that in the second half of the residency now that, knock on wood, COVID is calming down. I really just feel like I can't even say it at this point for fear that I'm jinxing it. But I do think the nice thing about it is in some ways I can see how important that is to the adult's educational experience, what they can get out of it, how they can think about their teaching differently. They've been really productive in producing lesson plans, content, videos, things like that we're able to share with the world. But I feel like not having as much direct experience working with kids, they're not learning as much as I would hope. I think the kids are getting a lot out of it, but the adults aren't getting as much as I hope they will going forward. So it's nice to see, and part of it for us, it's really that reframing is really important. It's like taking it off being a one-way street where we think we have all the expertise to just distribute to people and say no, we need to be thinking of this as a communal activity. And I also think that's how we can actually get away from ideas of like high art and what's too fancy or too important or too erudite. If you think about it as a holistic community, it's like, well, everything is accessible because we're all bringing different things to the table and trying to take everything people bring to the table seriously. Whether it's a 4-year-old child or a 40-year-old child or an 8-year-old child.
Exactly. And what's so profound to me is that while the museum is dedicated to children's artful experiences, it's also just as important for the adults to be involved in the experiential learning process. And like you said, having the permission and encouragement to be ourselves and learn through exploration and play is something that should be accessible to all. I definitely think we need to get away from these hierarchies in culture, which permeate into the arts and education. For example, play is serious business. Kids know it, but we adults clearly forget this from time to time. I think the Children's Museum of the Arts does a good job in dismantling certain hierarchies by incorporating the art of both children and professional artists in curated shows. I can say from experience that this changes the perspectives of those who view it. The seamless dialogue between the artwork of children and adult artists is evidence that there's not really too many topics or themes that can or should be demarcated by age.
I think, it's about the kind of continuum of art that we're all sort of joining the flow of ideas, no matter what age we are. We can be inspired by anything, and that should be a kind of equalizing force. So one example is like we have a project going up now with the artist Tamasha Jackson. Created a mural that we are putting up at 550 Washington Street, and she wanted to include artworks by children, and so she just asked us to put out a simple prompt, like, how do you imagine peace? And we got all of these artworks from kids responding. They made drawings of all kinds of different stuff. Well, I spent a few hours on the phone with her when we were first looking at all of the artworks that had come in response, and from looking at those works, she was inspired to really think about taking the project another step forward and building a summit, a peace summit, where we would pull the themes from the works that the kids had made and bring in specialists from different fields. So we could see lots of kids are equating peace, the idea of peace, with ideas from nature, and so we could bring in someone from the Sierra Club and have a conversation about how we interact with the climate. So those kinds of things, really being able to say what the kids did on their own can actually lead us to the next step, and then we can have them in conversation with adults in other contexts. So we all kind of just become part of the same mix.
It's great that the children's ideas and visions are shaping the course of these large-scale collaborations, and that through this process they get to see the big impact that they have in their community and the world at large. So I'd like to tie things together and conclude on the question of, what do you envision for the future of arts education and child-centered institutions?
I think what what I really want to see is just more and more of education that really comes out of the space of community exchange across all ages. And I think that can take lots and lots of different forms. I don't think that the kind of institutional forms that we typically think of as arts education now are really working all that well. I think, pretty easy to point to why they're broken at the sort of graduate and undergraduate level. They're possibly expensive. But then they also suffer in the sort of childhood range where they get sort of stuck into curriculums that were really designed for a kind of symbolic learning, like reading, writing, arithmetic, and not really thought of as an entire way that knowledge is created. That might have a different relationship to time. It might not fit into a 45-minute class period. It might not be so results-driven all the time. So I think the future of arts education that I want to see is where we can actually connect the way that kids more organically, I hate that word organically, the way that I think kids more naturally learn and embrace the world through the arts with the way that adults at a more professional level are thinking, and really seeing them as joining them together.
Yeah, we use that term instructional scaffolding in education a lot, and it's like when it's used correctly, it should really be a way of just, as you're describing, coaching and mentoring and providing a safe and non-hierarchical space for their ideas to flourish. And anyone who's been to the Children's Museum of the Arts knows that that is exactly what goes on there. So I encourage you all to go, and I thank you again, Seth, for joining me today in conversation.
Oh, of course, thank you. Really thoughtful questions, and it was a pleasure to talk to you. Let's do it again soon.